I had just set my tools against the fence post when I heard a sharp splash that didn't belong to the river's usual churn. The current was running high from recent storms, but this was heavy or desperate. I stepped to the edge, the damp earth giving under my boots, and squinted into the glare bouncing off the water. Something moved, dark hair flashing once before sinking again. My hands went cold before the wind could do it, and I was already shrugging off my coat, my mind fixed on that single patch of churning foam where the figure had gone under. Before I tell you what came next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a choice that could change the rest of your life. My name is Thorne Maddox. I was born along the northern edge of the territory where winters bit deep and summers burned hot enough to split fence rails. My father worked a small herd on rough pasture, and my mother kept the home, with a patience forged in church pews and kitchen heat. We were taught that a man's worth was measured in the calluses on his hands and the steadiness of his word, that you showed up for neighbors, same as you did for family. On Sundays, the work slowed long enough for us to gather under the plain clapboard roof of the local chapel, the smell of wood smoke and strong coffee mixing in the air. Life changed when the war called. I rode out in a Union cavalry regiment and came back with a shattered knee and a folded flag in my satchel. Not long after, fever took my wife and our little girl in the same cruel winter. That cabin built with my own hands near the canyon rim became less a home and more a shelter for a man who'd run out of reasons to leave it. I kept to myself, trading cattle in town, when needed patching my own fences and mending what broke with what I had. The land out here was its own kind of company. Dry wind across the grass, the creak of the well handle, the soft groan of timber when the night frost set in. Folks in town chased other things, land speculators with polished boots, merchants talking railroads and gold hands, quick with a handshake and quicker to forget it. My world stayed plain and honest, held together with grit and a few good tools. That morning, I'd ridden out to check the south fence line after a hard storm. The sky was pale, holding the last chill of night, and the soil near the riverbank was still slick. One of the posts I'd set last fall was leaning again, the ground washed out more than I'd figured. I was bracing it with my good leg when that splash tore through the quiet. It wasn't driftwood, and it wasn't a fish. I caught sight of her again, just an arm this time, before the river pulled her under. I didn't stop to think about the cold or my knee. I left my tools in the mud, my coat on the bank, and made for the water. The shock of the river hit like a hammer, cold enough to lock my chest tight. The current pulled hard, shoving at my legs, but I kept my eyes on the dark hair that surfaced just ahead. She came up once, mouth open, as if to call out, then slipped under again. I reached her in 3 strokes, got an arm around her waist, and kicked hard for the bank. My knee burned with each kick, but I held on until my boots hit the shallows. We collapsed onto the muddy bank, both gasping. Her skin was cold, lips pale, and the soaked deerskin dress clung to her in heavy folds. A bruise was rising on her temple, and her bare feet were scratched raw. I eased her upright so she could cough the river out, then gathered her in my arms. She was heavier than she looked, the weight of her soaked dress pulling against my grip. The cabin sat uphill through the trees, and each step sent a spike of pain through my bad leg, but I didn't stop. The mule-colored gelding stamped and snorted as we passed, his breath fogging in the morning air. I carried her straight inside, laid her on the bed, and pulled every blanket I owned over her. Her ankle was swollen, but not broken. I draped my old wool coat over her shoulders before turning to the hearth. My hands were still wet as I struck a match, coaxing the fire until it took hold. When I looked back, her dark eyes were half open, watchful, but weak. "You're safe," I said quietly. She blinked once as if she'd heard me, then let her eyes close again. I stayed in the chair across the room, boots planted, keeping an ear on her breathing while the fire worked on warming the cabin. By the time dawn gave way to full morning, the orange light had stretched across the floorboards, reaching the foot of the bed. She was sleeping easier now, the color returning to her cheeks. I hadn't slept. Questions had been circling all night: who she was, where she came from, why she'd been alone in the river. When she stirred, I leaned forward. "You understand me?" I asked. A pause, then a faint nod. "You hurt anywhere?" She touched her ankle and winced. I crossed to the bed, crouched, and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth. Her eyes stayed on my face the whole time, not afraid, just measuring. When I asked her name, she hesitated, then said, "Sana," her voice soft, the syllables carrying an accent I didn't know well. I told her mine, then let her rest while I stepped out to tend the horse. The cold air cleared my head, but not my thoughts. A woman like that didn't end up in the river by accident. Inside, she was sitting up, my coat pulled close. I poured water into a cup and handed it to her. She drank in slow sips, then set it down without a word. I asked about family, and she looked away, jaw tight, giving no answer. We spent the day in near silence. She watched the fire while I went back to the south fence, the memory of her in the river never leaving my mind. By evening, she was asleep again, the blanket pulled high. I stood in the doorway a while, listening to the wind outside and the steady crackle of the fire. The next morning was colder fog lying low between the trees. She woke when I set a tin cup of hot water by her bed. "You need food," I said. She nodded, and I brought her beans and a piece of cornbread. She ate without hurry, careful in her movements. When she tried to stand, I stopped her with a hand. "Not on that ankle yet." I rewrapped it, noticing the raw scrapes on her knees and shins. Whoever had left her near that river hadn't cared if she made it out alive. I didn't press her for the story. That would come in its own time. I found an old flannel shirt in the trunk and handed it to her. "Your dress needs mending." She took it, glanced at me once, then stepped behind the quilt I hung from the rafters to change. When she came out, the shirt hung loose on her frame. Sleeves rolled up bare legs, moving carefully across the floor. She motioned toward the hearth broom, and before I could tell her to rest, she was sweeping slow circles. Later, I saddled the gelding to check the cattle up by the north ridge. I left her with water, the fire burning steady, and the rifle propped by the door. The ride was quiet, the kind where every creak of leather and breath of the horse keeps your mind turning. She hadn't come from upstream, no signs there, and the nearest camp was 2 days away. Whoever put her in that water had been closer. When I returned, she was on the porch leg, propped on a stool, mending her dress with slow stitches. She looked up, needle paused, as I set down the day's catch. "You shouldn't be out here," I said. But she only nodded and kept working. That night she sat in my chair near the fire legs, curled beneath her, my shirt loose at the collar. I cleaned the rifle at the table, the only sounds the scrape of metal and the pop of the logs. When she finally lay down, she left a space between us, but her breathing came steady in the dark. By the fourth morning, frost had coated the porch rail. I was splitting logs behind the cabin when she came to the door, the mended dress folded on the table. She wore the shirt, still sleeves rolled, bare feet tucked under her as she worked at the fire. "You sleep all right?" I asked. "Yes," she said, her voice clearer than before. I told her I was heading to the creek to check snares. She wanted to come, but I shook my head. "Not yet." She didn't argue, just looked down and nodded. By the time I got back, she was sitting on the porch step, wrapped in a blanket. "You should have waited inside," I told her. "Needed air," she said, her eyes on the tree line. I sat beside her, the boards creaking under our weight. "I'm not keeping you here," I said after a while. "You're free to go when you want." Her hands eased in her lap. "I know. I stay for now." She asked if I had people. I told her I did once, wife and daughter, but fever took them 8 winters ago. She was quiet a long time before she spoke. "I was promised to a man from another band. I said no. My uncle said I brought a curse." They tied my hands and left me near the river. The quiet after that was long. I didn't tell her what I thought of the kind of man who'd do that to his own kin. She already knew. She moved back inside and began cleaning the rabbits I'd brought in her hands, sure with the knife. We ate together in the low light of the fire, no words needed. That night she sat in the chair again, my shirt slipping from her shoulder. I draped a blanket over her without speaking. When I turned in, I heard her cross the floor later, the mattress shifting as she lay down behind me. She didn't touch, but her warmth was there steady through the blankets. The fourth morning broke colder than the others, a thin crust of frost glazing the porch rail and making the air bite at the skin. I was behind the cabin splitting logs in a slow rhythm, careful with my footing on the slick ground. I didn't look toward the door, but I knew she was awake by the faint clink of the poker against the hearth inside. When I stepped in with an armload of wood, she was kneeling at the stove, coaxing the coals into a steady flame. My shirt still hung loose on her frame, sleeves rolled, bare feet tucked beneath her. The mended dress lay folded on the table. She looked up when I set the wood down. "You sleep all right?" I asked. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. I told her I was heading to the creek to check the snare lines. She said I come. I could see the set in her jaw, but her ankle wasn't ready for that walk. "Not yet," I said. She looked down at her hands, not arguing, but the quiet carried her disappointment. I left her with the fire steady and the rifle leaning where she could reach it. By the time I came back, the sun had climbed higher, and I had 2 rabbits cleaned and ready. The cabin was empty. My gut tightened until I saw her on the porch step, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She turned her head as I stepped up. "You should have waited inside," I said, but she only answered, "Needed air." I sat beside her, the boards creaking under our weight. "I'm not keeping you here," I said after a moment. "You can leave when you choose." Her fingers eased against the blanket. "I know. I stay for now." She studied me, then eyes steady. "You have people," I told her. "I had once a wife, a daughter, both gone to fever, 8 winters back." She didn't look away when I said it, just lowered her gaze. When I asked about her own, she took a slow breath. "Basim, promised to a man from another band." I said no. "My uncle said I brought a curse. They tied my hands, left me near the river." The words hung between us, quiet and cold. I didn't press further. She rose and went inside, taking up the knife to dress the rabbits with a practiced hand. We ate in the low light of the fire. Afterward, I stepped out to bring in more wood. When I came back, she was sitting in my chair again, her legs curled under her, the shirt collar slipping from one shoulder. I draped a blanket over her without a word. Later, when I lay down, I heard her cross the room, the mattress dipping as she settled behind me. She didn't touch, but the warmth of her stayed through the night. The next day, the weather held cold but clear. She was on her feet more, moving carefully around the cabin, folding blankets and sweeping the floor. At one point, she found the small pouch of herbs I kept and asked if she could use a stone jar. She ground chamomile with sumac, poured hot water over it, and handed me the cup. "For your leg," she said. I drank without asking how she knew. By late afternoon, she'd changed back into her dress. The torn neckline was still open, her stitches holding the rest together. She stood by the bed looking at me, where I sat near the fire. "You sure?" I asked. She stepped closer, took my hand and placed it at the small of her back. Her forehead came to rest against my chest. We lay down without hurry, each movement measured. I undressed her carefully. Her skin was warm, her breath steady. She unbuttoned my shirt, her fingers sure. There were no words until morning, and even then we said nothing about it. The light slipped in through the cracks in the wall, and she lay on her side watching me, without a trace of fear. That day we rode out together for the first time. She sat behind me on the gelding, her arms light around my waist, her cheek resting against my back. At the fence line, she braced posts and held nails while I hammered. We worked in rhythm, speaking little. When I stumbled on the slope, she was there with a hand on my arm. "You should sit," she said. "I'm fine." She studied me, but didn't argue. We ate under the bare limbs of a cottonwood, the river murmuring below. She watched a hawk turn slow circles overhead before asking, "Why you live alone?" I told her it was easier not to care again. She turned her head toward me. Still afraid, I met her eyes. Less than I was. She took my hand, then holding it without another word. On the ride back, I asked why she hadn't tried to run. "You didn't treat me like I was nothing," she said. That answer stayed with me longer than anything else that day. We reached the cabin as the light faded, the wind easing through the trees. Inside, she moved easily to the hearth, tending the fire as if she had always been there. That night, she braided her hair in my chair while I read from a worn book. When she finished, she crossed the room and sat on my lap without hesitation. "If someone comes for me," she asked quietly. My arm tightened around her before I could think. "They'd have to go through me." She nodded, satisfied. We went to bed early. She undressed in the firelight, each piece falling in its own time. I followed her lead, and the rest of the night passed in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The snow had been falling on and off for 2 days, enough to blanket the clearing and soften the world beyond the cabin. Inside, the fire held a steady glow, and Sana moved with a quiet rhythm, folding clothes and stacking them on the trunk. She wore her mended dress again, the torn neckline still open, the rest stitched strong. When she looked at me, her eyes didn't dart away the way they had before. That afternoon, I found her by the porch rail. Her gaze fixed on the tree line. The air was sharp enough to sting, and the boards underfoot creaked with frost. I stood beside her a moment before she spoke. "Back where I'm from, they'd have me married by now," she said, her voice even. I waited, letting the words come at her pace. I said no. My uncle said I brought shame. They left me tied near the river. I could see her breath in the cold as she looked out over the snow. I swam, or tried to. Her eyes met mine. Would have died. I didn't answer right away, only nodded. The sound of wind in the pines filled the space between us. Inside, she set to work on a pot over the hearth, her movements calm and sure. I fetched more wood, my boots leaving deep prints in the snow. When I came back, she was standing near the fire, her hair loose down her back, the heat bringing a faint color to her cheeks. That night, she took the chair near the fire, while I sat at the table repairing a leather strap. After a time, she rose, crossed the room, and stood before me. "You sure?" I asked, my voice low. She stepped close, placing her hands lightly against my chest. We went to the bed together, not hurried, each movement deliberate. The firelight lit her skin, and the silence between us was steady, not strained. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a pale brightness over the ground. Sana was already up, kneeling at the hearth to stoke the fire. I poured hot water into a cup and set it beside her before pulling on my coat. "Fence on the east side still leaning," I said. "I'll brace it before the next snow." She looked over her shoulder. "I help now." I studied her a moment, then nodded. We rode out together, her behind me on the gelding, arms light around my waist. The trail was narrow in places, ice crunching under the horses' hooves. At the fence, she handed me tools, braced posts, and steadied the nails between her fingers. We worked without much talk, the cold air keeping our breaths visible. When my knee stiffened and I paused, she stepped in close. "Sit," she said. "I'm fine." She didn't push it, just watched until I moved again. By midday, we sat under a bare cottonwood eating bread and jerky. She watched the sky, a hawk riding the wind above. "Why you live alone?" she asked. I took my time answering, afraid to care again. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. Still afraid, I met her eyes. Less than I was. She reached for my hand, holding it for the rest of our rest. On the ride back, I asked, "Why didn't you run?" She was quiet for a stretch before saying, "You didn't treat me like I was nothing." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than the wind at our backs. That evening, she sat on the floor near the fire, her hair in her lap as she braided it. I read from a worn book, the sound of the pages mixing with the crackle of the logs. When she finished her braid, she walked over and settled into my lap without hesitation. "If someone comes for me," she asked quietly. I felt my grip tighten before I could stop it. They'd have to go through me. She nodded once, as if that was enough. We went to bed early, the fire's glow soft on the walls. She undressed in her own time, moving toward me in the dim light. I followed her lead, and the night settled into the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be broken. Snow had settled heavy on the roof overnight, the kind that muffles every sound except the groan of timber. I woke to find her still beside me, her arm draped across my ribs, her breathing deep and even. She didn't move when I rose, only opened her eyes, enough to follow me with them, as I crossed to the stove. By the time I'd stoked the fire, she was sitting at the edge of the bed, pulling her hair over one shoulder to braid it. The light from the flames caught along her cheek, softening the hard lines that had been there. When I first brought her in, we didn't speak until I poured water into a cup and set it on the table. She came over, took it with both hands, and drank slowly. That afternoon, she joined me outside to clear snow from the path to the shed. The cold stung our faces, but she didn't complain. When the work was done, we stood together a moment, watching the breath of the gelding plume in the air. She pulled my coat tighter around her shoulders, then looked toward the distant ridge. "This place," she said quietly, "it feels still." The days fell into a rhythm. She moved about the cabin without asking what needed doing, mending shirts I hadn't worn in years, sorting shelves, tightening loose straps on the pack saddle. When she found the small pouch of dried herbs again, she brewed tea without being asked, setting it by my hand while I worked at the table. "For your leg," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. One evening after we'd eaten, she stood by the bed and untied the sash at her waist. The dress slipped to the floor. I didn't look away. She stepped toward me, and I held her without speaking. The smell of pine smoke and wool clung to her skin, her body warm in my arms. That night was unhurried, each movement deliberate, neither of us asking for promises we weren't ready to name. The snow deepened in the days that followed, closing us in more than before. I spent mornings patching the roofline where drifts gathered. She joined me without needing to be told. In the afternoons, we prepared food for the days when the weather would keep us inside completely. She was as steady with a knife as she was with a needle. One morning, as we peeled root vegetables at the table, she looked up suddenly. "Your wife?" The question was plain. I set down the knife. "Claire." She was kind, too kind for this world. Her eyes searched mine. Then she asked, "And your daughter?" I told her about Ruth, 5 years old, lost to the fever that took her mother. I came back from hunting and found them buried. She rested her hand over mine. "I don't ask to replace them," she said, "only to stay." I nodded once. "That's all I want." That night, she sat against me on the floor, her legs stretched across my lap while she held one of the few books I kept. She traced the words with her finger, asking for the meaning of some. When she reached one, she said it aloud, "Family," and looked at me. "What is family to you?" I took my time answering. "Someone who stays. Someone who sees you and doesn't turn away." She nodded as though that matched what she already knew. Later, she stood by the bed and let the dress fall again, stepping forward without hesitation. I met her there, pulling her close, the quiet between us heavier than words. The snow was falling again outside, but inside nothing moved but us. When we settled beneath the blankets, she lay with her head on my chest. "What if they come again?" she asked. I kept my hand on her back. "Then I'll still be here, same as now." She didn't answer, only pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The air that morning was so still, I could hear the snow shifting on the pines. I stepped out with a mug of hot water, watching the frost sparkle in the pale light. That was when I caught it, the faint drumming of hooves carrying through the cold. I set the mug down on the porch rail and turned toward the sound. Sana was already in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the same distant line of trees. She stepped out, handing me the rifle, without a word. We stood together, watching 6 riders emerge from the shadows, their approach slow and deliberate. They stopped short of the cabin horses, snorting in the cold air. One man dismounted older, with weathered skin and a sash of red and white feathers across his chest. He spoke first in Apache, his voice low but carrying. Sana answered in the same tongue, her tone steady. After a short exchange, the man looked to me and spoke in clear English. "You pulled her from the river. You took her in. She lives because of you." His eyes held mine. "In our law, that means she belongs to you." I shook my head slightly. "I don't own her." He nodded once. "Not own, not hold. Protect. Make family. That is what it means." Sana stepped closer, her hand brushing my arm. "They mean you're my husband now," she said evenly. I glanced at her, then back to the man, and gave a single nod. The elder bowed his head, mounted, and with a brief signal to the others, turned his horse back toward the trees. We watched until they vanished into the ridge. Inside, Sana hung my coat back on its peg and sat near the fire. "They came to see if I was safe," she said. "You are," I answered. She nodded slowly. "I know now." That night there was no hesitation. She moved toward me in the quiet, her eyes steady in the firelight. I met her halfway, and the rest of the evening passed without a word spoken that wasn't needed. The days after settled into a new rhythm. The snow held deep, but we worked through it together. She moved easily about the cabin now, making repairs without asking, setting meals on the table before I thought to. Her ankle had healed. Her steps were sure. One morning I found her outside barefoot in the snow, her face lifted to the sky. Steam curled from the cup in her hands. I shook my head. "You're going to lose a toe." She opened her eyes and turned slightly, a faint smirk there. "It's not cold," she said. I stepped down from the porch and tossed a blanket across her shoulders. "You're not used to this kind of winter?" She leaned against me. "No, but here doesn't feel cold." When we came back inside, she helped me patch the roof where snowmelt had seeped through. She worked with the same care she brought to the garden tools, to the sewing needle, to the rifle she'd cleaned once, without my asking. In the evenings, we sat together, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. The firelight steady on the walls. One night, as we peeled vegetables for the next day's stew, she asked about my wife and daughter again. I told her, and she listened without looking away. "I don't ask to replace them," she said, "only to stay." I told her that was all I wanted. Later, she stood by the bed, letting her dress fall, stepping close. I pulled her in, feeling the warmth of her skin under my hands, the scent of wood smoke in her hair. We moved together without rush, the snow outside falling heavier than before. When we lay down, she rested her head on my chest. "If they come again?" she asked. "They won't," I said, "but if they do, I'll still be here." She didn't answer, just pulled the blanket tighter. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside nothing felt unsteady. By late winter, the snow began to soften under the midday sun, pulling away from the fence rails in narrow strips of brown. I spent the morning hauling feed to the cattle, while Sana cleared the path to the shed, her steps steady in the packed snow. The cold still lingered, but the air carried a hint of change. Inside, she set a kettle on the stove and brushed her braid over one shoulder. "You'll plant again soon?" she asked. "When the ground's ready," I said. "First the fence posts, then the plow." She nodded, her hands busy with the tea leaves. The days had taken on a shape I could trust. We worked side by side without needing to name the tasks. When I climbed to the roof to clear a drift, she steadied the ladder. When she mended a saddle strap, I held the leather firm so her needle could pass through. Evenings were for the fire, for her slow questions and my measured answers. One night she asked, "If I stay through spring, you teach me cattle?" I looked up from the book in my lap. "If you want to learn." She tilted her head. "If it's a girl, she learned too." I smiled at that. "She'll ride better than both of us." Sana didn't say more, but her hand rested low on her stomach for a moment before she turned back to her sewing. The first week of March brought a clear morning and a hard sky. I saddled the gelding to check the east pasture. Sana rode behind me, her arms light around my waist, her cheek warm through my coat. At the far fence, we found a post leaning the thaw, loosening its base. She braced it while I worked the mallet, her breath visible in the chill. When we stopped for a meal, she pulled bread from the saddlebag and handed me a piece. We ate in quiet the creek below, carrying the sound of meltwater over stone. After a while, she said, "You think about leaving here?" I shook my head. "No." "You?" She looked out across the open land. I thought I would. "I don't." That evening, we sat on the porch, watching the light sink behind the ridge. The air was cold, but she stayed beside me, her hands wrapped around a mug. "I don't want to belong to any law," she said. "Not yours? Not theirs?" I met her eyes. "You don't. You choose this, and so do I." She leaned against me, then the boards beneath us creaking in the cold. Somewhere out in the trees, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. We stayed until the last of the light was gone, then went inside. Later, in the dim of the cabin, she took my hand and placed it against her stomach. "You'll teach him cattle?" she asked again. "If he wants to learn," I said. "And if it's a girl, she'll ride better than both of us." This time she laughed, a quiet, unguarded sound I hadn't heard before. The fire had burned low when we finally lay down. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in a slow, even rush. I closed my eyes, knowing the seasons were turning, and with them, so was the shape of our life. By the time the first wildflowers pushed through the thawed soil, the snowmelt had filled the creek and the pasture grass was coming in strong. Sana walked slower now, her hand resting against her middle, but her eyes still carried that same steady light. The cabin felt different with the windows open, the breeze moving through. I spent the days setting new fence posts and readying the corral, knowing we'd have calves before long, and before summer's end, a child. At night we sat by the fire or on the porch, the air holding the scent of pine and damp earth. One afternoon, a rider came down the trail. It was Sheriff Markham, hat in hand, his gelding flecked with dust. He dismounted slow, glancing toward Sana before stepping up. "Thought you should know," he said. "The men who came looking for her, they won't be back. Word's been sent clear." I nodded, feeling something ease in my chest. When he rode off, Sana stood beside me, quiet for a while. Then she asked, "It's over?" I looked toward the ridge where the sheriff's horse had vanished. "It's over," I said. Her shoulders eased and she went back to hanging laundry in the sun. Weeks turned into a rhythm that felt like it had been waiting for us all along. We worked the land, cooked simple meals, and watched the light shift across the canyon each evening. Some days were long, some short, but everyone felt claimed, not borrowed. One evening, as the sky went to gold, Sana sat beside me on the porch steps. "You think they'll remember us?" she asked. I shook my head. "Maybe not. But we'll remember. That's enough." She smiled, then resting her head against my shoulder. The last of the sun slipped away, leaving only the sound of the creek and the soft rustle of wind through the pines. Life on the frontier had taught me many things: how to endure the lean years, how to read the sky for storms, how to stand when the ground shifts beneath you. But it was this, the quiet choosing of each other, the building of something that could last, that felt like the truest work I'd ever done. And if there's one thing worth carrying forward, it's that you don't have to be born to the same blood to be bound by the same heart. Out here, family is what you make and keep. Thank you for listening, friend. If this story stayed with you, take it with you, share it, and maybe remember it the next time you see the sun dipping low over an open stretch of land.